Good morning. In 1955, my father, Louis Michel Erreca, was only 28 years old and he was the San Diego sheriff. I was only 3 years old then, and my two older sisters, Renee and Theresa, and my mother was 24 years old at that time. And we often visited to the Buono house on the bay, across from the South Mission Beach. Uncle Victor Buono was nearly 17 years old, and he went inside and out of the beach bay home with his buddies. And Uncle David was around 8 years old, and he had time to play with me and my two sisters, and we were swimming and lying on the beach bay sand. At that time in our lives, everything seemed perfectly in the year of 1955, before Victor Buono would become an 18 years old stage theater, television, and motion picture actor just around the bend. My uncle Victor Charles was 16 years old in 1955, and he was in the 11th grade at St. Augustine High School. My father Sonny was 27 years old, and he left the La Mesa Police Department and soon became a San Diego County Sheriff. David Francis was 8 years old, and Uncle Tony was 13 years old, and the Buono family was still living at 3266 Bayside Walk. I was 2 years old, and my half-sister, Teresa Ann, was now going to Johnson Avenue Elementary School. That was only 5 blocks away from our house. As I grew older, I spent my summers in the El Cajon Theater, watching motion pictures of the Three Stooges, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, and Elvis Presley. In Tucson, Arizona, at the Lyric Theater, Peggy Kellner was directing No Cowards production Blithe Spirit on February 20, 1955. She would soon be meeting Victor Charles in the following year. On July 20th, 1955, Peggy Kellner was now employed at the Oak Globe Theater. She was then working closely with founder and director Craig Knoll, and they were staging the San Diego National Shakespearean Festival, with 3 productions being Measure for Measure, Hamlet, and The Taming of the Shrew. My mentor, Martin Garish, won the National Collegiate Players honor, tying with actor-director Peter Maroney when performing in the role as Willie Loman in The Death of a Salesman at the University of Arizona. Garish was a fabulous actor, director, and teacher of theater throughout his theatrical career. He once had his name in the New York Times in August of 1955 when he played in the lead role of playwright Paul Green's production of Lost Colony in Virginia. They also printed a photo of him, which turned out to be a great memento for him. In October, Garish and Maroney worked together on the very same production of The Remarkable Mr. Pennypacker, written by Liam O'Brien, and Garish was the assistant director. When I first met Martin Garish, his acting days had slowed down a bit, but he was still known as one of the best directors in San Diego. Bette Davis came back to the silver screen in 1955 in the motion picture The Virgin Queen, starring Richard Todd and Joan Collins. It was filmed by 20th Century Fox and was released on July 22nd, 1955. We can't ignore Joan Crawford coming out with 2 motion pictures in 1955 with Female on the Beach, starring Jeff Chandler and Jan Sterling. It was filmed by Universal Pictures, and it was released on August 19, 1955. Her second motion picture was Queen Bee, starring John Arlen and Betsy Palmer. It was filmed by Columbia Pictures, and it was released on November 7, 1955. During the early year of 1955, there were darkening clouds hanging overhead of the Buono house. Soon, it came knocking on the door at 3266 Bayside Walk. Was an alarming wake-up for my step-grandfather, Victor Francis, and his family. He was indicted for smuggling exotic birds and parrots from Mexico. It's hard to imagine what my father Sonny must have thought when going to work downtown as a San Diego County sheriff. My father's last name is Erreca, but not Buono. That at least gave him shelter from being tagged as the stepson of Victor Francis Buono. When my 2 sisters, Theresa and Renee, and I were growing up in 1955, there wasn't a single word ever mentioned to us about this crushing episode with our step-grandfather, Victor Francis. I'm confident that my Grandma Mert had a few words to share with her husband, but nothing was ever spoken to us. Victor Charles was 16 years old, Tony Edwards was 13 years old, and David Francis was 8 years old when this situation came crashing down on everyone's heads. At the beginning of May in 1955, everything looked pretty good when living near South Mission Beach, and with Victor Francis owning his own bills bond business in downtown San Diego. Victor Charles was doing well at St. Augustine High School, and he was learning the art of becoming an actor. There was a new reality that kicked open the doors in late May of 1955, making everyone's lives not as comfortable as it was before. There was a barrage of newspaper clippings following the bird smuggling indictments on June 4, 1955, where 3 names were printed: Clifford Duke, Louis Glenn Ballard, and my step-grandfather, Victor Francis Buono. With my step-grandfather, Victor Francis's name in the newspapers, it must have paid a heavy toll on his son Victor Charles's emotions. This might be the reason why he didn't perform in any plays throughout 1955. I just can't imagine how difficult it must have been for Victor Charles to go to school knowing his peers might know about what his father had done. The evidence was growing against Victor Francis and the other 2 men, and I haven't found out any clear information of what month or year that Victor Francis lost his ownership of his bail bonds business, but it could have happened much later, around 1958. Most importantly, what was going on within the Buono family in late 1955? Was my grandparents' marriage in jeopardy over that recent smuggling debacle? How did this influence Victor Charles and David Francis and the rest of the entire family members? When I was growing up, my father Sonny and my mother Hilda continued taking my 2 sisters and me to visit with our Buono family. To us, everything seemed completely natural while we played on the sand in Mission Bay at the beach. There was Granny Grunt sitting in the kitchen with Grandma Mert, and we smelled food cooking on the stove, and with Victor Charles darting in and out of the house and eventually leaving somewhere with his friends that only God knows. It was like nothing ever happened to Victor Francis, to our young ears and eyes. We just didn't know what happened to the Buono house then.